Welcome to VCR, a vintage cinema rewind. We're bringing old movies to new viewers. I'm Blake,
And I'm Michael.
and today we're doing part two of our Piranha discussion, our deep dive into the 1978 cult classic horror comedy film.
Yep, and it's quite a deep way to go, I
Wow,
suppose.
taking a deep dive into the horrors of what lies underneath.
Yeah, definitely.
So, if you haven't seen this movie, recommend going back and checking out the primer episode for this. You're definitely not gonna want spoilers into a horror movie. You want to save that fun stuff for your first watch through.
Yeah, and it is fun. It is fun. Like we said last week, it's fun. It's not a bad time, that's for sure.
Yeah, and where we usually start off in the deep dive discussion is kind of starting in front of the camera and working our way back. And actually, even before that, and this is already going to get into spoiler territory, so beware of that. I actually was thinking about this after our last discussion. We kind of debated the writing of the story and plot and characters. And so I thought that the characters maybe weren't written as well necessarily, but you kind of made the counter argument that, you understood all of the characters. Like they were consistent for the most part throughout the film.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't say that they were deep or complex characters, but I do
Mm-hmm.
think they were well characterized.
And I kind of wanted to elaborate on that a little bit getting started in this conversation because I was thinking about that a little bit. And I do agree with you. What I actually think is that what makes the characters really interesting is we understand like each of their motivations. And it's pretty well written. Like there's enough exposition here and there throughout the opening pieces of the movie, and each time a character is introduced where we learn like who that character is and what they represent relatively quickly, right?
Right, yeah.
The only character that I would say has a brief lapse of maybe consistency in writing, and this is, to create maybe some contrived plot writing there.
Which this movie never does. Not even a little.
And that's when the mad scientist jumps in the water to save the boy.
Yeah,
That was the moment where I was like, this is a stretch here on this one.
That was the moment. So in our last episode, when I said there was something we had to talk about, this is what I meant. Like, this is that moment where I was like, oh, I guess we're doing this. Like, this is happening. Like, I guess if you haven't seen it yet, the deal is there's this mad scientist with a really nice head of hair. I'll give him that. And they take him prisoner, and he kind of delivers the exposition that, like, he was assigned by the government to do some Operation Razor Teeth where they would create mutant carnivorous piranhas and, like, use them as, like, a biological weapon against the enemy. But then after the war, like, the project was shut down, but he went rogue because, in his own words, and this is a direct quote, there was so much more I could do with the piranhas. And, okay.
And this is where like every character is, written to the extreme of what they're trying to portray, right? And so like he's mad scientist for the sake of being mad scientist, right?
Yeah, like stock mad scientists, like they just took him off the shelf. Like, here he is, like here's the character. So then they're going down the river on their like Huckleberry Finn raft, and he's just like, "What, you think I'm responsible for this? Like, I was just doing my research." And then they find a little kid in a canoe, and the canoe's sinking, and the mad scientist inexplicably has, I guess, an attack of conscience, leaps into the piranha-infested waters, and saves the child, like sacrificing his own life in the process. And it's just a completely preposterous moment. Like, even for this movie, it's just like, okay, like, I guess we're doing this.
And like the best explanation they could give was like when our two main characters are kind of discussing it after, right? And they're basically like, oh well, he just really in that last moment had some sort of like human experience there and wanted to save this kid. It was like, but you guys were like 20 feet away. You made it to the kayak before it sank.
Also that, like, yeah, it was just, that was one of those moments where like I'm a sucker for a good redemption arc, but like that had to be history's fastest redemption arc. So,
and most contrived again.
Yeah, and like I will say the only thing that I guess kind of redeemed that moment for me is that it does increase the tension, because suddenly the guy who knows the most about the piranhas is dead.
Yes. For all of our harping on it, like that is really well built into there, that we do lose the only real explanation for how we're going to get rid of these things.
Yeah, so I mean, and then even in the next scene, like, so they have his body on the raft, but then the piranhas start attacking the raft. They're like, oh, his bleeding corpse is attracting more piranhas.
Right.
So, like, even that, like, immediately after his death, he's causing more problems for the heroes. So, I guess in that sense, it works. It's just still a very, I guess, yeah, let's call it a human moment.
And stepping back for a sec, so I wanted to kind of touch on that just because it was a thought that had kind of been pressing against the back of my head since we had our last discussion. I want to front load this and say that I had a lot of fun with this movie, and I think you had a lot of fun with this movie.
Yes.
But with a low budget film like this, there's a lot of faults to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't necessarily detract from my enjoyment, because I'm going to be honest here, like I've kind of been debating the last few days since watching it, like how I wanted to approach this particular section, because either I can, you and I can discuss and have fun with like each section. I can balance that with like, critiquing things as I go through, or I just save like all of my nitty gritty picky notes for the end. And I just don't know how to meet that discussion.
I can appreciate where you're coming from. I mean, we can turn into red letter media and just dunk on this movie and laugh about it, or we can, I don't know, have an actual discussion about it. But this movie is also like, I don't know, and what am I trying to say? Like, this is a movie that kind of, in a lot of ways, knows what it is. This is a movie that kind of like, it's winking at you the whole time.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if we just start dunking on it, the movie's probably going to be laughing with us.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right?
And that's the thing, is like, this is a movie that is relatively fun to watch with other people, and you're probably going to like, point out those things while you're watching it too.
Yeah. Yeah.
There are movies that like you should be, quiet and fully engaged in, and, let it sweep over you. And then afterwards you have the discussion for like 30 minutes kind of thing, those really deep, like, once a year kind of big movies. And then there are movies like this where it's like fun to be talking and joking throughout while you're watching it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. This isn't a movie you should watch alone. And I know that because I watched it alone.
So did I in this particular instance, actually.
Okay. But we still had a good time. So,
exactly. Yeah.
But we probably would have had a better time if we watched it together.
Yeah. Let's step back to the plot and kind of everything going on. I want to start with the opening scene with the kids. I was sitting there and I was just laughing to myself, because I was like, what teenagers are hopping into an industrial looking pool to go for a midnight swim? I was like, there's no way you were ever getting me in that water. Like, there was different machines kind of in there and like everything.
Yeah. I'll tell you who, Blake. Teenagers in bad horror movies will do that.
Yeah, it was that part. Like, I had a good laugh at the beginning there, because I was like, oh my god, there's no way you would get me in that ever.
It's like a moment right off the shelf, right? Like, it's two teenagers looking for a place to like, fool around, and then they both get murdered by a monster, right? So it's just it's the Jaws opening, but with no subtlety.
Yeah, exactly. That is the perfect comparison there. Just Jaws with no subtlety.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny, like, they get in the water and the guy's like, hey, you bit my toe, even though she's like 4 feet away from him.
It's like back Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, when they're like going down the raft. He was like, stop touching me, and they're like 6 feet away.
Yeah.
So the next kind of spot that I want to talk about is when we get to the military base with Paul and Maggie kind of looking for the teenagers there.
Mm-hmm.
Did you notice the little like claymation-y kind of little fish monster thing that was...
Yeah, I did want to bring that up. I was just... because it never really comes back, does it?
Right. No, it doesn't. And so, and this is maybe coming back to effects and filming a little bit, but basically like that weird lizard fish thing, I was hoping for more of that later on and for it to tie back in. It turns out Joe Dante as well was hoping that would return again.
Oh, no.
but they didn't have enough of the budget to do it later, so they kind of did it once and done. Like, it was actually an homage to
Like
Ray Harryhausen.
Harryhausen?
Yeah, the stop motion monster special effects guy. And it's really funny too because, like, you know, I knew going into this that Joe Dante is somebody who's done Gremlins and Small Soldiers before. So, like, seeing that, I was like, oh, this is kind of like a dry run, you know, for those kind of movies and having like the stop motion stuff in there. And I gotta say, like, I'm a sucker for good stop motion. I love, you know, 70s and 80s stop motion in.
Oh, and these looked great too.
Yeah,
like,
they did.
Like, they all had a ton of personality. It's just.
Yep.
It's funny how, I guess, looking back at it now, I actually kind of forgot that was even in the movie, but like I guess the implication is like these are his other experiments.
Right.
But that just kind of makes it funny because it's like, why isn't the movie about these guys? Like, these guys are way more interesting than evil piranhas.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. I wasn't sure how they were going to tie them back into this film because it just, like, you know, it happens there and it feels so important at that particular moment in time. Mm-hmm. And then it just, because of budgeting reasons, that's kind of, you know, one of the effects of being on a micro budget is sometimes things don't always work out the way you want them to.
But he was like, hey, we paid for these stop motion monsters. I'm throwing them in the movie.
Yeah. But, and it, like I said, I did enjoy it. It's just I almost wanted more of it.
Yeah, kind of. It is kind of funny in hindsight. It's almost like the movie kind of playing itself in a weird way, or undermining its own monsters in a weird way, which is kind of the ultimate. It almost kind of just makes this movie more charming in a way. It's like, we'll undermine our own message just for a quick and dirty kind of thing.
Homage to somebody that I really respect kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I was going to say the other thing, like the other movies that you've seen the homage to, so Ray Harryhausen, the stop motion guy, he's most known for Jason and the Argonauts and Clash of the Titans, like the original Clash of the Titans, not the one that came out like 10 years ago.
The one in the 80s.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. We don't talk about the one that came out 10 years ago. We just don't, okay?
I would be interested in watching both of them side by side, I think, because I don't know that, like, the original Clash of the Titans has the best reviews either, so...
Well, it came out after this movie, right? Like, wasn't it, like, the 80s or something?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this was pre-Clash of the Titans. Yeah, it'd be nice to do, like, a old versus new kind of thing.
Yeah, well, and that's what this movie kind of slots into, and not necessarily this year, but like Jaws is one of the biggest movies of all time, and so I thought it was really cool to do a parody, almost comparison to Jaws and what we liked about this and that kind of thing. But I think in the future going forward, what we'll do is more movies that either, you know, have modern day counterparts or have like way back when counterparts to them kind of thing.
Yeah. That's kind of the other thing is this movie really a direct parody of Jaws, or is it more of like kind of a bootleg knockoff version of Jaws? You know what I mean? It is about an evil sea fish monster, but like there isn't really a whole lot of like direct comparisons.
I would argue differently, actually. Like, I would say this is a direct parody because it just takes, like, all the aspects of Jaws and kind of, you know, puts it in this low-budget horror comedy aspect. Like, you know, everything's just turned up to 11 here. We've got pure capitalists who are like, I'm not going to let these piranhas slow me down for anything. Like, nothing's going to let me slow me down from closing this down. Whereas, like, you know, there's the comparison to the mayor of the town.
Right.
You've got Maggie, who's like the fish out of water compared to...
Pun intended?
Yeah, exactly. Compared to Sheriff Brody from Jaws, who's the fish out of water in that situation. Paul Grogan is the stand-in for...
Oh, Quint?
Yes, Quint in Jaws. Like the grizzled, like, kind of knows his way around the water, even if it's on this little dingy raft, and knows the area, right?
And then I guess the mad scientist character is like Richard Dreyfuss's character.
Exactly.
Except with a dumber death. Yeah, I don't know if that makes it a parody, though, or if it makes it just, again, like a knockoff bootleg version. Like Jaws with the serial numbers filed off.
I don't know, because I think we're getting into semantics here probably, but...
I guess so. I guess to me, just a parody is more like... You know, I'm thinking more like...
We're post-scary movie, though, like, generation, right?
Yeah, to me, a parody is more like you have to have actually... A parody, especially like a bad parody, is like you need to be really familiar with what we're making fun of in order to get the joke, right?
Right. Yeah.
Whereas this movie was telling its own story, albeit with familiar elements.
Yeah, I would agree with you there. So I guess agree to disagree because that's such a small semantic thing.
Agree to disagree. You know, you knew I was a writer when you invited me on this podcast, so these were semantic disagreements were bound to happen.
True. So the bigger implications of this film I found actually pretty fascinating, right? Because, you know, this film is telling a relatively grounded story, right? It's the story of these mad piranha, like mutated piranhas being let loose on this poor unsuspecting town and the campground and the resort and all of that sort of thing. But the bigger implication here is that, as we learn, even though they make it in time to the dam to stop the piranha from getting to the ocean and potentially, you know, breeding like crazy and dominating. Mutating, dominating the world's oceans.
Yeah,
waterways.
I can just imagine like an alternate cut of this movie where like piranhas take over the world and there are people just standing around like, this is the dumbest apocalypse we've ever been a part of.
Then that's when it's really interesting because they're able to say, okay, we stopped the dam, but it just so happens that the alternative waterway to get to the ocean now where we think the piranha are heading, which I guess fish inherently probably know, like I guess salmon would swim that direction kind of thing. So there must be something, you know, within fish to tell them which way is towards the ocean kind of thing.
If you're a fisherman, sound off in the comments below. Yeah,
I would love to know more, to be honest.
We don't really know what we're talking about. One of my ex-girlfriend's dads was a fisherman, so I should break the silence of 5 years and see what he thinks.
That sounds like a terrible idea, but...
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, so then they're like, okay, well, we've stopped them here. We've stopped them from the direct route, but now we've got this indirect route that's become a problem. And oh, by the way, Paul, this is where your daughter's summer camp is and where she's at, right?
Whoops. I did want to talk about that scene because I have one little gripe with it.
Sure.
It's not a big gripe, but I do find it funny. There is a little bit of inconsistency with like how deadly the piranhas are. Right? Because it seems like, so, okay, spoiler alert, the piranhas attack the kids and the camp counselors in the lake, right?
Right.
And with the mad scientist in particular, it seemed like he was only in the water for 20 seconds and then he died of his injuries, right?
Right.
Whereas it seems
okay, small side note here. The mad scientist guy had been through hell up until that point. He had, like, been beaten. He had been in a car accident. Also and then he was eaten alive by piranhas.
Yeah. He had a really bad day.
He had the worst day of his entire life.
So the kids and the camp counselors are all getting nibbled on, and like there's blood and they're screaming and it's horrific. But like it seems like most of them are okay for the most part.
Yeah, I have the final death count written down somewhere, and I'll pull that up later. I want to say it's around 37, 38 was the final count.
But then in that same scene, there's the one likable camp counselor, like the one who's trying to help Grogan's daughter get out of her swim lesson because she's scared of the water.
Right.
And she kind of falls off her little dinghy, and she's dead within 5 seconds.
Right.
So it's a little like,
well, and you know what? Like, I don't want to jump through hoops for this movie necessarily, but like,
no, I don't either. I just, for me, it was a little quirk of the movie where I'm like, how deadly are these piranhas?
And
like,
I guess I didn't notice that at that particular moment in time, and the reason why I wasn't thinking about that is I guess it kind of made sense to me in the way that, like, this is the way I rationalized it, I guess, is that there was like 100 kids in the water there.
Okay, you know what? That's fair.
Yeah,
That's
maybe
fair.
there's like 10 to 30 piranha at this point in time.
Just a single swarm, not like the whole.
Yeah, like I don't know how many piranha. Like I don't know that the scientist guy said how many piranha were actually in the pond at that point in time. So like depending on how many piranha we're dealing with, right off the bat when there's all the kids there, the piranha's attention is a little all over the place. And then once everybody's out and it's really only the one girl left in there.
It's like, screw it. Let's get her.
Yeah, the piranhas are just like fully, engaged at that point in time.
Engaged. The one small detail I did kind of appreciate about that scene is that I mentioned my favorite character is the one like snooty camp counselor. Like guts, Grogan, guts. And like, I noticed he was actually helping kids out of the water.
Yeah.
Like he almost kind of had like a heroic moment despite everything.
He did. Yeah.
So good for him, I guess. Like,
I think the biggest pitfall for me of this movie, I want to get it out of the way, I guess, now before I get into more fun things as well, is the fact that, like, at no point in time did Maggie and Paul really sit Dr. Mad Scientist down and, like, have him explain, you know, what was going on or how to stop the piranha. Like, it just really, you know, like, when we first meet Dr. Hoke, Dr. Mad Scientist Hoke,
you can just call him Dr. Mad Scientist.
Okay.
I know who you're talking about.
Yeah, he runs in and he's like, "No, don't do it!" And
no,
then he just,
what are you doing?
He just straight up attacks them. Like, at no point is he like, you know, while he's got the bar, like while they're pushing the bar at each other, is he like, if you release that, you're releasing hell on this world or something like that. All he needs is like that little bit and then, you know, you put that little bit of doubt in somebody's mind and they're like, why?
Or you walk into the room, you see two strangers, and you just say, "Hello, what are you doing here?" Like, yeah, you don't jump from 1 to 100 right away.
Yeah, and then, you know, later on, like I said, they never really push him to get any answers from him beyond like the why.
Don't they though? Like, I feel like they try, but he's just not really cooperating.
Yeah,
like there's
a
that
little bit.
scene on the raft where Grogan keeps asking him questions, and he's just like sitting there petulantly silent.
Yeah, a little bit. He explains like the fact that they were created to be weapons in Vietnam, basically, right?
Yeah. So, but then he had to pull the world's weirdest heroic sacrifice, and now he's dead. So,
yeah.
I don't know that bothered me as much as it bothered you,
Mm-hmm.
but it's one of those moments where it's just like, it's one of the many contrivances that make up this story.
Right.
So, also, have you heard the term idiot plot?
No, I haven't.
It's a term, I forget who coined it. I think it was maybe even one of the Simpsons guys in the 90s. No, it's called the idiot ball. It's the thing where it's like a character will hold the idiot ball and that moves the plot forward. Mm-hmm. Meaning the plot only moves forward because someone's being an idiot. Nice. So it might be a case of the idiot plots, which is I'm okay with in a movie like this, you know?
Yeah, I think in this kind of a movie where it's not, you know, like elevated storytelling, I very much agree. Like, it's not as necessarily as glaring of an issue because, you know, this movie is more meant to have fun and not to be like an ironclad, one of the greatest movies ever made kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the contrasts that I would have to that, right, is like, or comparison is Game of Thrones season 1 through like, I don't know, 5 or something. You know, the writing's really tight. It's really well written. It's based on a very famous book series. And then as we get to the end of the series, when we have all these plot contrivances and things suddenly go downhill, there's an expectation, right? And that expectation isn't met. Whereas in a movie like this, with such a small budget, with like, you know, a bunch of no-name actors, basically a no-name director at this point in time, there are no expectations. And so when you go in and you have fun, it doesn't matter some of that stuff, right?
So let this be a lesson to you kids listening to this podcast. Like, if you're going to suck at something, suck straight out of the gate. Well, and then no one will mind.
Know your lane.
Yeah.
Well, and this is the other problem too, is that like Hollywood either doesn't make these kinds of movies anymore because they have to make big budget movies, and that's part of like one of the biggest problems with Hollywood right now is everything has to be a $200 million budget and get advertising for everybody, and everybody has to enjoy it, and you know there aren't niche movies anymore.
Well, there still are. They're just smaller. They're quieter. You have to kind of go out and find them. Like, I feel like B movies are still getting made. It's just, where are they?
Yeah,
I genuinely don't know. Like,
yeah, exactly. And B movies like this that are enjoyable, but also, you know,
schlocky.
Yeah.
Well, like, I mean, occasionally a good. Well, actually, I shouldn't. If I finish this sentence, it's going to offend you, but I'm going to do it anyway. You know, movies like this and movies like Barbarian. You know, they do kind of slip through the cracks every now and then. I'm not comparing this movie to Barbarian because Barbarian was actually quite tightly written, but...
Yep. Agreed. And, like, it's just, you know, I guess what I'm trying to say is that, like, Hollywood and the movie theaters aren't giving movies like this any attention anymore, right? And so
No.
by extension, if a movie isn't being marketed to me and there's 6 other $200 million movies that are being being marketed like crazy to me, I'm probably just never gonna know or hear about that other movie unless it grows like a big cult following.
Or unless word of mouth kicks in and it's sort of
Exactly.
How did you hear about Barbarian, or did you just find it one day?
I heard about it through some other podcasting, some modern day podcasting groups that like talk about movies as well.
Okay.
And it actually did relatively well. Like, and that's kind of the other thing that's really interesting is that medium to low budget horror movies have a pretty good track record, honestly. Like,
I've heard that.
the last few years, we had a resurgence of the Halloween films. We've had Barbarian, the Scream movies, which is probably one of like tonally the biggest comparison to this. Like, it's a horror comedy kind of thing.
I didn't really realize how popular the Scream movies were until recently.
Yeah.
Like, people really like those movies.
Oh, absolutely. I've only seen one of them, actually. I've only seen the first one, and I do.
Me too.
I do really enjoy the first one. I've been
do
trying to
too.
convince Jess to watch it with me because I think she would as well. But the horror elements are outweighing the comedy aspects of it for her.
Does Jess not like horror movies?
No, she doesn't.
Oh,
Which is
okay.
funny because I love horror movies and I watch them a lot. So
Okay, well, you got 3 months till the wedding, Blake.
yeah,
That was a bad joke. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I've heard that a lot of famous directors actually started off doing horror. Like, it's apparently a good way to cut your teeth.
yeah, and I agree with that. And there's obviously something about comedy writers and horror writers and being able to blend the two, right? Because we've had Jordan Peele recently and the guy who wrote Barbarian, whose name is escaping me.
The wasn't he a Whitest Kid You Know alumni? Yeah. Interesting.
Zach Krager, that's who it was.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that guy. I wouldn't even really call this movie a horror movie. Like, I can't imagine anyone being scared by it.
No, and you know what though? I do think this is a good, well-made horror movie though, because there is tension, there is suspense throughout the film. I thought the big releases at the end, like the big climax scenes of the kids' camp, was pretty jarring. Like that, like really, disturbed me, I guess, in a way, because usually you don't see in horror movies like women and children being the primary targets. Maybe women, like young, like final girl kind of slasher movies, but not like kids. Not like it's not like usually like a camp full of unsuspecting children is horribly murdered.
I actually did read some reviews at the time, and I guess a lot of critics took issue with how women and children were victimized, I guess. As a writer, I do kind of admire the ballsiness of, we're going to threaten these women and children, and we're actually going to follow through on the threat. Like,
yeah, exactly. But that's what I mean is, like, I thought that was done extraordinarily well. Like, they went for it, and I think they landed the plane there, because I thought that was some really well done horror. And then at the end, again, when we get the final scene at the resort, like, is another moment of really well made horror at that point.
Yeah. Okay, I will concede that point. There are some flashes of genuine discomfort in the movie, despite many, many, many more flashes of gut-busting humor.
And the other thing is too is, like, I thought the implication of the end of the film was somewhat scary too, right? Because there's a possibility at the end of the film, it leaves it relatively open, that the piranha may have actually escaped. Like, we actually really don't know whether Paul's plan was actually successful or not.
That is interesting. Like, for all the lightheartedness of this movie, it does kind of have a slightly bitter ending.
I would say very bitter and quite dark too, because, like, Paul ends up in that, like, comatose state at the end of the film, like, and Maggie and his daughter are just standing over him crying, and we see all of, like, all of the people maimed and killed by the piranha.
Yeah, that's true. It is. I do remember thinking the ending was a little jarring, just in the sense that, like, again, this movie was mostly pretty lighthearted, and then at the end it's like, oh,
well,
piranhas.
Lighthearted in, like, a silly, like, fun romp kind of way. Like, it does quite live up to the comedy elements, but like I said, with the horror aspect of the film, it builds over time, and it's the final act of the film that's, in my opinion, really actually genuinely well made horror.
Yeah. Yeah. I would agree with that. I think by that point I was a little distanced from the movie in the sense that I was kind of like I was used to laughing at it.
Right.
So it didn't quite draw me back in, but
Uh-huh.
I will agree with that.
Yeah, it is almost a full tonal shift. Like, and there are people who die in the film, like the opening scene, the kids die, and then, there's the dad who's like joking around, like, oh, my arm's stuck, and then it's like, and then there's even like Paul's friend, the older man, who's down fishing and drunk by the water, and he has his legs like completely eaten off, and then he tries crawling back to his cottage for help. Like I thought those kind of elements, it's again like it's giving us those little like crumbs of like, this is a pretty sinister story what we're telling here, but it really saves all of the punch until the end.
I guess so, yeah. I just had a really like even when that guy died and they're like, oh, he died crawling away, I was like I was laughing at that point. Like, maybe I'm just showing my slightly sadistic streak, but like
Well, and I don't necessarily like honestly, I think horror movies can just as easily be laughed at as they can be you can be scared kind of thing, right?
yeah, like a lot of the classic like Halloween, Friday the 13th movies are almost like cartoons. Like they're just yeah, like, they're silly when you get
Yeah.
right down to it.
Yeah, exactly. I guess it's kind of your headspace going in, but at the same time, like, if you're going into a horror movie to have fun, like, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I
No.
think you're the right kind of audience to enjoy a horror movie then.
That's right. Yeah. However you want to enjoy it.
What you were saying earlier about, the comparisons to Jaws and, how I was talking about the mayor compared to Buck Gardner, the guy running the resort.
Yeah.
Again, like most things, this movie takes a lot of those ideas of Jaws and turns them up to 11, especially with like the military involvement. Like there really isn't, much military involvement in Jaws. It's more just local police kind of thing. But there's
Right.
like a really heavy military presence in this film and like anti-military, anti-capitalism ideas in it.
Which is absolutely a sign of the time this movie was made in, right?
Exactly.
This was the 70s when everyone was bitter and disenchanted with their government,
Yeah, yeah.
which we can't relate to at all in 2023.
Well, and that's what I was saying. Like, back when we did the movie draft last year when I did Network, I was like, oh man, like it's so funny that like a movie like Network just feels so timely again now. It's almost like, every 50 years or so, history kind of repeats itself.
We got to do it again.
But it really feels like the 70s and the 2020s are very similar for a lot of reasons.
So stay out of the water, kids.
Yeah, so I don't know. This movie there's a timelessness to aspects of this film that make it still enjoyable and hold up relatively well today. And this is also a comparison to Jaws. Sometimes the less is more aspect can make a film hold up better, right? Because if a film's not completely relying on the crutches of special effects and CG and stuff like that, it's harder to sometimes date the film beyond like, clothing or like the type of camera work or something like that. But what I'm saying is like this movie holds up in my opinion better than a lot of like CG heavy movies of like the late 90s early 2000s kind of thing.
Sure. Like I don't know, even like I mentioned that like I genuinely did have a lot of affection for the leads. Like I think my favorite scene in the movie might be after they've captured the mad scientists, where Maggie is staying over at Grogan's cabin and he's just drunk on the couch and he's
Right.
just talking about how he's divorced and like he's out of work and he's drunk and like he's collecting unemployment until September and then he's got to go find a job and then she kind of like comes on to him and it's kind of just like, yeah, man, like I get it. Like, you're having a spell of hard luck. We've all been there.
Yeah.
So, hey, like,
Well, and like that kind of goes back. There's another moment. One of the quotes that I really enjoy of this film is kind of, our meeting for the first time. Maggie's trying to explain the situation, why she's there kind of thing. And Maggie's like, so I was wondering if there are any places around here they might be, or if they may have gone for a swim. And Paul's like, well, if they drowned, they'd be swept down to the dam. So you're starting off at the wrong end. And Maggie's like, boy, you're the wrong end, all right.
yeah, that was fun.
There's a goofiness even to like the quotes and the dialogue of this film,
Oh
right?
yeah, like the scene where they're trying to like break out of the military base and there's a guard outside their tent. And he's just like, you're a woman. Go like distract him. Like, use your your feminine wiles to distract him. And she's just like, but what if he's gay? And he's like, then I'll distract him. Like,
that was genuinely really funny and like surprising, because sometimes you don't expect like jokes like that as well from older films.
Right. And then Maggie goes outside and just first thing out of her mouth, she's just like, "Are you gay?"
Yeah, and then she flashes him because she can't come up with any other reason that like to convince him to look away or whatever, right?
Right.
And I was gonna say that too, is like, it's so funny because this movie uses nudity a lot in it.
Yeah.
And I was trying to come up with like the logic behind why they were using all the nudity, because this is pretty consistent with, I think, this era of like, I don't know if it's nudity to get people to the seats of like horny teenagers wanting to go see a movie with nudity that contains a lot of nudity in it.
Tits. Yeah.
I don't fully understand. Like, there was definitely a reason to have that in there, right? But
sure. I guess it kind of comes with the whole B movie horror aesthetic.
Yeah,
right?
and that too, I think.
You've got genitals and you've got blood. And they go hand in hand. So,
just all the emotions.
Yeah. I will say, like, this is sidebar, but I really did like the first scene where we meet Maggie, because it shows us the character in a really compelling way. Mm-hmm. Like, her boss is like, she's like, I'm going to go find those teenagers. And her boss is kind of hesitant. She's like, I found lots of people. He's like, yeah, but that was in the city, and now you're going out into the burbs. Right. And then she's like, I can handle it. And then she's like storms off. And the boss just stands there. And then she comes back because she forgot the tickets, right?
Right.
So it shows us all we need to know about Maggie right away is that she's enthusiastic and she's eager, but she's also not that bright. Or like,
right.
It's not that she's not that bright, but like she's a little in over her head.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what makes the character so likable.
Well, and that's the thing as well, right? Is that each character is written in a way in that one or two sentences basically explain the character each time we meet one of the characters, right? Like, there isn't ulterior motives. There aren't like, there's not a lot of foreshadowing into what the character might or might not be thinking. Like, each character is written in a way that we're immediately supposed to know who and what they are and what they stand for and their primary motivations. And that's, in a film like this, in a 90-minute film like this especially, that's good writing, in my opinion.
Oh, yeah. Brevity. That kind of brevity is good in any kind of story.
Yeah, and again, this is something that I think we're missing a little bit now in films. And a part of it's probably, the Marvel problem of, like, every person needs an origin story, right? And every character has to be sympathetic or something like that, or we have to empathize with every character.
Every character has to be like witty and kind of generically likable.
Yeah.
By the way, in our last episode I said our viewers are gonna have a jar that says movies Michael hasn't seen.
Right.
They're also gonna have a jar that says Blake complains about Marvel movies.
100%. This is a bingo card, and
right.
We just hit that one. Yep.
So stamp your cards, people. We talked about this a bit last week, but I like the fact that like everything, it was like the whole universe was conspiring to slow down Grogan and Maggie.
Yeah.
Like at one point they get arrested and then they have to break out of jail, which is another really funny scene. Like,
right. Yeah.
where Maggie just starts destroying, like tearing out the pipes in her cell. She's like, I found a plumber once and he used to do this to break out of jail. Like,
and then like, yeah, she has to pull the guy's pants off and everything for the keys. Like,
right. And she has to like knock the guard unconscious, and you see her kind of like close her eyes and like look away as she's about to hit him.
Right.
And then they drive by the sheriff who arrested them and chuck the pants in his face.
Yeah.
Like, so unnecessary, but so funny.
And even going back, like, like the mad scientist crashes their car immediately, like, because, Grogan just couldn't be bothered to ever own a vehicle, even though he lives like completely, he's an alcoholic who needs alcohol, but also can't drive into town to get himself alcohol.
Yeah, really. Like, and then his best friend also doesn't have a car, right? Remember in that first scene, he's like, that car is where it belongs, up on blocks.
Right.
I watched a movie with my girlfriend over the weekend called Bone Tomahawk, which is
Oh
a...
God.
Oh, you've seen it? Yeah.
No, I haven't seen it, but I know what it's about.
Okay, and like she really didn't like it because she just found it too intolerable. Like the way everything just keeps getting worse for the characters.
Right.
She found it too much, but like to me I was like, you know, especially as a writer, I'm like, you want to torture your characters.
Yeah.
You
Oh,
want
yeah.
victory to be hard won. So like to me, contrivances that fuck over the characters don't bother me. It's when the contrivances make things easier for the characters. I'm like, okay, no, they didn't earn that. You know
Right.
what I mean?
Yeah, you know what? I very much agree with you because, like I've mentioned before, like the season 1 of The Terror is one of my favorite shows of all time because everything is working against the primary characters, and you know things are not going well.
And that's when you really get to like know a character. There's a quote from some writer where he said like, you know, character is what someone does under stress, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, the fact that like everything kept going wrong for Grogan and Maggie and everything kept slowing them down, I was like, this is good. Like, this is good tension building.
Yeah, I really agree with you, actually. And, you know, like, even though there are little aspects of this film that don't work, as a whole, everything connected with me. And
yeah,
the writing served its story relatively well.
Yeah, and I mean, you can take like the whole idea of killer piranhas is absurd, but I mean, it's not that absurd, but it's a little absurd.
Yeah, it was at that point in time. Maybe like I think this is the first time piranhas are in film. But at the same time, you know, growing up, I think as a child, I think because of a film like this, piranhas have entered the zeitgeist more or less, right? Like, you know, as a kid thinking back, like I always in the back of my mind was like, I don't ever want to go swimming in the Amazon or somewhere where piranhas live because they would just eat me.
Yeah. I didn't know little Blake was scared of piranhas, but
a lot of existential thoughts there. So
yeah, I was scared of tornadoes when I was a little kid. I was always paranoid that a tornado would sweep me away.
Yeah, like, and that's the thing is that these kind of films, in comparison to Twister, is that like it taps into a primal fear. And whether or not that fear is likely or not is beside the point.
It's like man versus nature, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. But like, yeah, tapping into those primal man versus nature ideas, even though, you know, like, when will I ever be in the situation of killer piranhas or like, you know what I mean?
Never say never, Blake. You never know.
Yeah. Some mad scientist will have some plot to eat me.
What are you doing? Well, I was driving through. We had a severe thunderstorm warning this weekend, and I was driving down the highway. And at one point, I thought to myself, "Wonder if today's the day a tornado finally gets me."
True. I want to talk sequels, prequels, and reboots relatively quickly.
And there are sequels, aren't there?
There are sequels, which actually really interesting. Is apparently there's a novelization of this movie, which is somewhat baffling to me. I was not expecting there to be an accompanying novelization of this. Although I guess back pre-video games, that would be your secondary monetization.
A lot of movies still get novelizations. Like, do you remember once? What was it, like 1,000 Ways to Die in the West?
Yeah.
I was at a Chapters one day, and there was a novelization of that too. So
interesting.
Actually, I'm just pulling it up on Goodreads right now because I want to see what the score is.
Fair enough. Well, you're looking at that, so
3.1 and 30 reviews, so not good, not great.
Apparently, the novelization actually goes into some of the backstory of who Maggie is.
Okay.
So I guess her boyfriend walked out on her, and so she hired a private detective to find them. And then she got like really interested in the process of finding somebody to the point where by the time her and the private detective caught the ex-boyfriend, she actually didn't care about him at all anymore. And she knew kind of what her profession was going to be. So
that's actually kind of charming, actually.
Yeah, it is.
It's not a bad backstory.
No, not at all. And so that's why I wanted to bring it up is that, you know, that is an interesting element from the novel, kind of a complementary piece of writing, similar to Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. There's some interesting details in the novelization of that adds to the film.
Maybe I should check that out because I didn't actually like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood that much.
Yeah, I'd be interested in hearing what your thoughts on that book are. But on the flip side, there are going to be people who have the counter argument of like, we don't necessarily want supplementary materials to explain
And
a film.
speaking of supplementary materials, I'm just looking at the reviews on Goodreads, and I'm going to read you one. There's a 4-star review that says, "A delight, takes you through the movie almost frame by frame." And this was a review from May 1st, 2017 by a person named Fishface.
Nice.
So
You know what? They were at the right place at the right time there.
yeah, I'm glad they had a good time, genuinely.
Kind of the sequels and everything else related to Piranha so basically like mid 70s and through 80s, because Jaws was like the biggest film of all time at that point, similar to how superheroes have dominated our movie watching experience for the last 10 to 15 years.
Put a quarter in the jar, people.
There was like a ton of sequels adjacent to this film, like obviously. So at the same time as this film being released, Jaws 2 was released. And there's a lot of interesting trivia about those two movies as well, right? Because they were actually released mostly simultaneously. I think Piranha might have come out a few weeks before.
Oh, really?
But that's why the studio wanted to shut down Piranha, and they almost did end up shutting down Piranha and never seeing the light of day. But it just so happened that Steven Spielberg.
Different Steven.
Yeah, so it just so happened that Steven Spielberg got an early cut of the film and got to see it and really, really liked it a lot. So he actually pushed for the studios to allow its release.
Well, I guess Steven Spielberg's a pretty cool guy.
Yeah, and he considers this one of the greatest parodies and the best Jaws parody ever made. Because let me list to you all of the sequels of not only of Piranha, but just of the Jaws genre and subgenre. Of man versus nature, thriller, horror.
By the way, you've made it when like your movie is so successful that it spawns an entire subgenre.
Exactly.
Of people ripping it off.
Yeah, 100%. So obviously there's Jaws 2, there's Jaws 3D, and there's Jaws the Revenge. Then other movies that came out around this time in the late 70s, early 80s were Orca, Tentacles, Killer Fish, Barracuda, Blood Beach, The Last Shark, Up from the Depths, Humanoids from the Deep, The Island of the Fishmen, Devilfish, Mako, The Jaws of Death. I think Great Blue Sea would probably factor into there.
We don't talk about that movie.
And these are like only like man versus nature in water kind of things too, right? Like think
Right.
of all of the other ones that we have. Most recently, Cocaine Bear, for example, Sharknado, like which I guess is in and out of water. Jaws, and also I guess adjacent to this because of the success of a parody film, in the similar light as Jaws would kind of spawn all of these and continue to spawn all of these. And then we get to the sequel, the first of the sequels to Piranha, right? Which is literally called Piranha 2: The Spawning.
Okay.
Which just so happens to have a very, very, very famous director behind it, who you may know, Michael, James Cameron, the guy who made Avatar and Titanic, created the sequel.
Rings a bell.
Yeah. He created the sequel to Piranha and disowned the film because he hated it so much.
Well, that sounds like a very James Cameron-y thing to do.
Yeah. It has a 3.8 rating on IMDb. Now, I'm not saying that IMDb ratings are perfect, and obviously with ratings, they're judgmental. They're subjective at best, right?
Yeah.
But when James Cameron tried to get his name off of the the credits of the film, it's not going to be great.
No.
Although on the flip side, I believe that was James Cameron's first film, and as we've seen over the years, James Cameron has an absolute fascination with the ocean, right?
He sure does, actually. So
that definitely would have been one of the main kind of things to kick off that fascination in film.
I guess it's the same way that this movie was kind of the trial run for Gremlins. Maybe Piranha 2 was almost the trial run for, something like Titanic or one of his other water-based movies.
Yeah, The Abyss.
Yeah. I like that in my head I was like James Cameron water, and I went right for Titanic instead of The Abyss.
Well, even like, the second Avatar movie, which you've already forgotten about.
You have too. We saw it together, sir.
Oh, true. And then we do actually even have a few more sequels to Piranha. So in 1995, there was a made-for-TV Piranha film. And then in 2010 and 2012, I don't know. I'll have to look back at the history of movies and why they decided to remake these again. Oh, I know why. Because Piranha 3D came out in 2010. So that's the 3D aspect coming off of James Cameron's Avatar. And
it all goes back to James Cameron.
It all comes back to James Cameron. It always does. There's two people who are running Hollywood, or who ran Hollywood from 1980 to 2010, and that was James Cameron and Steven Spielberg. But anyway, and then Piranha 3 Double D came out in 2012, which by that name I think means it's basically a porno.
I'm just looking it up on Wikipedia right now, and you may be onto something. The Wikipedia article says the film grossed 8.5 million worldwide and was panned by critics.
But what's really interesting, actually, is Piranha 3D has Jerry O'Connell and Richard Dreyfuss, and also Ving Rhames in it, and Christopher Lloyd. So you know what? It actually has some well-known names involved with it. So I think if you liked Piranha, you could probably find some enjoyment out of Piranha 3D.
I do remember reading, reviews. I remember reading a review in our local paper when it came out that was actually mostly positive.
Here's the thing is what's really cool about movies like this and movie series like this is I think if you enjoy one of them, it's almost worth your time just to even just hate watch some of them.
Yeah.
For me, I really enjoy watching a series of movies that are all kind of connected. Like, for example, when we watched Cube last year for the horror film, I ended up watching the other two because while I didn't like Cube, because of its uniqueness, because of the story that I was trying to tell, I thought that I would enjoy aspects of the other films, and definitely, mixed on that, those movies do not have good ratings. But if you're going into a film with no expectations, or the expectation is this movie is going to be bad, but I'm going to enjoy it because of its shortcomings, right? Then,
right.
I'm not going in thinking I'm so excited this is going to be my movie of the year. I'm going in well, I'm going to have fun for an hour and 20, an hour, 40 minutes, right?
Yeah, I'm going to watch this movie flail around.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think that, if you enjoyed this film...
No. I'm going to amend that. I'm going to watch this movie try its best.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that other than the fact that James Cameron's name is tied to Piranha 2: The Spawning, I think I would enjoy that film more in comparison to trying to go back to the 70s, 80s and watching a bad sequel. Because this is the other thing. We haven't talked really about this yet, but this was kind of my thought and kind of nice segue into effects and filming. Again, the less is more use of the Piranha actually worked really well because the special effects of the Piranhas I thought was actually very well done. They were just fish on a stick.
Is that what they were?
Yeah.
Huh.
They actually looked relatively good, and because we only see them here and there very interspersed, and often it's in the dark water, or there's a lot of splashing and stuff happening, they don't look like bad special effects in this film.
I don't know if I can get behind you on that. I thought the piranhas looked pretty silly. But
that's completely fair, but for me they worked, and it would be interesting as a comparison watching Piranha 3D, which honestly I'll probably check out because like I said, I have this weird, if I see one movie in a series, if I had fun with it, then I'll probably watch more of them. It doesn't even necessarily have to be a good movie series. On the flip side, Planet of the Apes is one of my favorite films of all time, but
right.
the original sequels to the Planet of the Apes all range from god awful to pretty okay and really interesting concepts, and I can get behind that sometimes.
This is a total segue, neither here nor there, but there was a trilogy of Planet of the Apes movies in the last 10 years.
Yeah, and
apparently
I've seen
they were
2 of 3 of them.
Apparently they were all pretty good.
I distinctly remember the first one. The second one, I can remember aspects of it, and I haven't seen the third one yet, but I really want to. I've been trying to like convince Jess to have a Planet of the Apes movie marathon with me, and she just won't go for it. And it upsets me because I really want to have a Planet of the Apes movie marathon.
Okay, well, just keep working on her, buddy.
She did not love the first movie, but I was like, you are living under a rock because the first movie is incredible.
You are wrong.
You are wrong.
It's kind of like when my girlfriend didn't like Bone Tomahawk, and I was like, that movie was amazing.
You'll have to talk to Jason about that next time you guys see each other, because he loved that movie as well.
Oh, it's so good.
I really do need to see it. That's one of those movies that I have on my list.
I'll watch it with you.
Sounds good. This is a weird tangent, but right now our movie list for the podcast and or like combined with my just general movie list is like over 500 movies long right now.
Fuck off. Okay.
So we could keep doing this realistically for the rest of forever. Because there are a lot of movies out there, and I think there are a lot of movies that range from like there are 10 people out there that are going to absolutely love this, and I can't wait to share it with them, to like everybody should watch this movie because they're going to have a lot of fun with it.
Yeah, that's fair.
So other effects and filming stories. I thought this was hilarious. So Joe Dante said that whenever him and his frequent movie producer that he worked with, Roger Corman, would submit like movies like this or any of his other movies to the MPAA, basically, you know, they would send them the original what they wanted on the film, and then MPAA would say, well, you need to cut this, this, and this to not get like the NC-17 rating or whatever. And so they would make those cuts, and then afterwards add all of that stuff back in right before the movie was released.
Yeah.
Because they basically just assumed that like none of the MPAA people were going to ever watch these movies again. So
that's awesome. That is
pretty
so
bold.
funny.
It's pretty bold.
Just like,
But were they wrong? Were they
no,
wrong?
I don't think they were.
So I thought that was an amazing little like piece of film history there.
Mm-hmm.
So the movie itself was filmed in 30 days and cost $660,000, which is, you know, relatively comparable to the other film that we've talked about recently, Aguare. Although you like this film quite a bit more than Aguare, is my
Just a bit. They both take place on a river.
That's very true. We've done a lot of river man versus nature kind of films.
This
recently.
is a river movie podcast now.
True. Oh, I thought this was really interesting. When they released the DVD version of the film, Joe Dante has a commentary on it, I guess. So you could listen to that. And one of the really interesting facts that he said is that the noise of the piranhas, the noises that they use to like make them sound like piranhas, was the noise of dental drills. So basically
interesting.
Yeah. So basically he didn't add any more like information about what they did, but like kind of the general consensus is they probably put the drills underwater and then filmed the noise of the drills underwater, basically.
Interesting. I would like to learn more about how they make sound effects for movies, because that's got to be a real trip.
Yeah, for sure. Like it's just a lot of probably really creative problem solving type people, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in that case, like it's so funny too, because, you know, like I said, this film taps into some primal fears, and going to the dentist is definitely one of those primal fears that people have, right?
Yeah.
So incorporating like those kind of noises into this film, I think this is a really good service to it as well.
It's like, hey, are you afraid of water? Are you afraid of piranhas? Are you afraid of drills? Here it is.
Yeah, exactly.
This is the scariest movie of all time.
Yeah, and so basically, I think that's all of the big effects and filming stuff I was going to talk about. So just a quick note on the score. This was scored by an Italian named Pino Donaggio. He was actually a frequent collaborator with Brian De Palma.
Huh.
I would have never guessed that I would have been talking about Brian De Palma while talking about Piranha, but...
Who's Brian De Palma again?
Very, very famous director of the 70s and 80s.
Okay.
Scarface, The Untouchables, Carrie, Carlito's Way.
Okay, big guy.
I think he did the first Mission Impossible movie.
Well, isn't that timely?
Very well-known director.
Interesting.
So there's that connection there. I thought the score was relatively good. Like, I don't really have a whole lot to mention about it because it's not like the primary focus of the film. It's not, you know, really like a stylish film that relies on its score to kind of, you know, pull a lot of emotion from you necessarily. It's just kind of good background score.
I did not even notice.
Yeah, and that's what I figured you were going to say. So the legacy of this film, we talked about it a little bit in the sequels, prequels, and reboots, but the other thing I want to mention is because of, the success of this and because Steven Spielberg was so fond of this film, that him and Joe Dante later collaborated together on the Twilight Zone movie. So there's that kind of connection there. I mentioned how Richard Dreyfuss played a character in the Piranha 3D movie and was obviously one of the central characters of Jaws. So I think this movie has a really cool film history, and I think it slots very, very interestingly into like a movie history watch kind of thing. It's surprisingly relevant.
It's the little movie that could, right? You know, it's just trucking along, doing its best.
Yeah, and
doing some things pretty well and other things not as well.
I can understand why it has a cult following, though.
Yeah, I can get behind that too.
And this is a film that I would probably recommend to a lot of people in my actual life. Like, if they were like, oh, I want to see like, kind of a horror movie, I'd be like, are you interested in comedy and horror or something like that kind of thing? And I would probably wholeheartedly recommend this movie. It'd be on that quite high on that list.
I have quite a few friends that enjoy just campy horror movies.
Yeah.
I'd be surprised if a lot of them haven't already seen it.
Well, and if they haven't, then you can recommend it to them.
I'll be like, oh, well, first I'll recommend our podcast so they can learn more.
What a great place to start. Okay, so let's wrap this up with our personal reviews and the partner factor. And you and I don't have any partners watching this with us in this case. We both watched it alone. So,
oh, so sad.
Do you want to start with your review?
Like I said, I enjoyed this movie more than I thought I did. Certainly more than Aguirre. So, I don't know. I'd actually maybe be charitable and give this movie like a solid 7 out of 10.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's completely fair. Like, I think that, again, the IMDb ratings for this movie don't necessarily do it justice. I probably fully agree with you on that rating. Like, this is a movie that's going to be very subjective, right? Like, if the comedy doesn't land for you, if the horror elements don't land for you, obviously this isn't your
If
movie.
you don't go into this with a sense of humor, like, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, like, is this movie going to land for every single person? No, and that those people are going to really hate this movie. But for a lot of people, this is a really fun one.
Mm-hmm. Like I said in Aguirre, you got to pass the vibe check.
Yeah. And this kind of vibe, I think, is more universal than Aguirre is.
Yeah. Aguirre was a bit more, like I mentioned, actually, I'm going to quote Bone Tomahawk and say that Aguirre it's just going to spit lemon juice in your eye. So
Yeah, true.
This movie is a little more welcoming.
Yeah. You know what? You know what movie is very, very similar in tone to this is Little Shop of Horrors, actually.
Oh, really? I've never seen that movie.
We did that last year. Jason and I did that last year on the podcast as our musical film, and it was probably one of Jess's highlights of the podcast that year.
Oh,
she
really?
Really liked it. I had a lot of fun with it, but Jess was like a massive fan of it. But it's funny because it has a very, very similar horror comedy element to it and a very dark, bleak ending to it as well, which is really interesting.
Well, I do love dark, bleak endings.
You would probably honestly love it. It's like I said, it's probably up there for musicals for me. It's really good. It's got Rick Moranis as the lead in it. Like,
I'm a big fan of Rick Moranis and actually also musicals, so I'm surprised I haven't seen it.
Yeah, you should check it out for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And go back and listen to that episode too while you're at it.
I don't know. I'm not really a fan of the pre-Michael era, but
Yeah. So in terms of my review of this film, like, this is a low budget campy horror comedy. Like, I really enjoyed all of those aspects. I really enjoy when those aspects kind of come together. Another kind of modern comparison that I'll put to this is Tucker and Dale versus Evil, which was like a really big horror comedy, is kind of like a cult classic on Netflix at one point in time, early days of Netflix when there was good stuff on there. And so, I had a lot of fun with it. I thought that there was some really great horror sequences. It does a really good job of balancing the horror and the comedy elements of it. You tip one way or the other kind of thing, and you might lose sight of what the movie's trying to be. But for the most part, I think it balanced both of those aspects relatively well. So yeah, I had a lot of fun with this one. It's a good movie. It's not a great movie, but it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the perfect encapsulation of this movie. Not great, but it's fun.
Yeah. Yeah.
This movie has heart. It's trying.
Yep. Yeah. Perfect popcorn flick, like, Friday night kind of thing, like we talked about, and have fun. Have a good time.
Enjoy it.
Yeah.
And then subscribe to this podcast.
All right. I think that's going to wrap us up for this week. I think next week we have a break, and then we will be doing the draft episode, which I'm really excited about.
Yeah, me too.
Like I said, I kind of have an idea of what you're doing. I haven't spoiled what I'm doing quite yet. I'm trying to keep it relatively tight-lipped. You might have a few guesses, but
what's your category again?
Mine is
series, right?
Movie franchise, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit more limited, I would say, because franchises, I think, are bigger post-2000s era, but there is some interesting stuff in the backlog that I checked out.
There certainly is.
And then Jason's got actor, actress.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's coming up.
Hope you enjoyed the pod. Give us a like or a follow. Hey, we don't say that very often on this podcast, but
yeah, this is a deliberate call to action. Get off your butt.
Really appreciate that. Get us out in the world a little bit more. Tell your mom about us. Tell your dad about us. You go
especially your dad.
Dad, I have the podcast for you.
Yeah.
All right. Anyway, have a good one.
Bye.